Hello and welcome. This is Jennifer McGuire. Today I wanted to reach back to a really old technique that I really like, and it is creating faux metal embellishments using heat embossing and die cuts. So I actually have 3 examples today for you, all using great dies from Concord and Ninth. And by adding heat embossing, you can create your own embellishments that look like they're made of metal. This is a really great way to get new looks out of your die cuts and also use up some of those embossing powders you may have collected. Let's go ahead and jump in. To create my embellishments, I like to die cut 3 die cuts and glue them on top of each other. I'm using dies from Concord and Ninth, so I've cut a bunch of these dies from some Nina White cardstock. You could use any cardstock for this. This is a great way to use up scraps. And I'm just adhering 3 on top of each other to get some dimension. Now you could glue these together any way you want. You could use stick-it double-sided adhesive before you die cut it. Then you can just peel it off and stick them on top of each other. I use my stamp runner, and sometimes some glue gets on the outside edge, so I use this eraser. It's for removing adhesive. It's an adhesive eraser, and I run it across my die cut after I've done all my gluing, and that seems to take away the stick that sometimes is on the outside edge. You could also use a sticker maker from Xyron. You could use any adhesive you want. I was kind of lazy and I grabbed for the adhesive that was closest, and that was my stamp runner. So I'm gluing 3 on top of each other just to build up some dimension. You could do just 2, you could do more if you want to. I think 1 layer die cut is a little too thin for the technique that we're doing. Now it's time for the fun part where we get to add that faux metal to this. I'm using my EK Success tweezers. I like these because they're self-closing, so you can use them to hold your die cut as you're heating it up. First, I'm going to press my Versamark ink over the entire die cut. And you want to press pretty firmly to try to get the ink pad to go around the edges. So there's ink on the sides of your die cut too. I'm dipping this into my Hero Arts gold embossing powder. That's a great gold powder. Now you could just pour embossing powder over it if you want to. I just happen to have mine stored in containers, so it's easy just to dip it in. So now I'm going to go ahead and heat this up, and you'll see after we do the heat embossing on this, it looks beautiful with a nice gold finish, but it's not really dimensional looking. It looks like you took a die cut and put embossing powder on it. So I'm going to put additional layers onto it. So once it's completely cool, I'm going to repeat the exact same process. So I put more Versamark ink on it, and now I'm dipping it again into the gold embossing powder. Now I try to keep as much embossing powder off the back of the die cut as I can because it's easier to glue paper to paper than an embossed surface to paper. So I brush away the powder from the back. If a little gets back there, that's okay. So here I'm going to heat it up once again, and you'll see it's starting to form like a dimensional shape as opposed to just a die cut with a coat of embossing powder on it. Now another thing you can do is while the die cut is hot, where that embossing powder is really hot, you can just take it and dip it in again. And that next layer of embossing powder will stick to the hot embossing powdered layer. So you could do that instead of allowing it to cool and putting another layer of Versamark ink on it. So that's what I did for this time. Now you can see it's starting to look like a dimensional embellishment. It's got that smooth finish to it. Now I usually do 3 or 4 layers, and that's it. You can do more, but what happens is it starts to drip down the sides and kind of changes the shape of the die cut, which is okay. If you want that look, you can get that. You can see that starting to happen on some of these leaves, but I think it's just beautiful. So I'm going to leave this as is. Some of that powder kind of goes down the side so you don't see that it's stacked layers of die cuts anymore. Okay, so now I'm going to repeat the same process with 2 other stacked die cuts. I'm going to do one with Hero Arts silver embossing powder and one with Hero Arts copper embossing powder. So this is one of the newer powders from Hero Arts. I love this copper. It's so beautiful. I poured the whole jar into a coffee filter so that I can dip my die cut into it after I've covered it with Versamark ink. This seems to work easier for this, but you could also pour the powder on if you prefer. So what I have here are 3 die cuts that were stacked, 3 layers, with different embossing powders. One has silver, one has gold, and one has copper. Now it varies how many layers you need to do to get a nice smooth look. It really depends on the powder. On these I did 3 or 4 layers. So I cut them a little bit shorter so they fit on my card better. And now I'm going to put adhesive on the back. I actually ran my stamp runner down the back just to put an even coat of adhesive, but I really want a strong hold. So I'm going to add some of my Ranger Multi-Medium. This is a very strong matte finish adhesive. So if any of it squirts out the side of my die cut, it'll dry matte and you won't see it. So I put a few drops of that here and there so I can make sure that this really dries and doesn't come off when I put this through the mail. Okay, so I went ahead and glued down all 3 of the leaves. I started with the one in the center so I could line it up and make sure it's centered nicely. And I'm using my grid pad that I work on to help me kind of line things up. So I just straighten my background cardstock piece on the grid mat, and I can use the grids around it to help me line things up. I love working on the grid pad. By the way, I'm putting these onto a piece of Neenah Desert Storm cardstock. This is a nice smooth craft that's light, and it's great with metallics on it. Okay, so now I have everything glued down. I'm going to flip this over and put something heavy on it while it dries. It doesn't take too long to dry. At this point, I wanted something in the background, so I decided to add some splatters, but I wanted it to be a metallic splatter to kind of go with the rest of the card. So this is the trick that I did. I used my anti-static powder tool just to make sure that everything was nice and ready for embossing. I'm taking some water, and I have this little jar that I squirt water from in my craft room, putting it in this little bowl, and I'm going to flick water onto my project. So I'm just dipping my brush into the water, and then I'm just going to tap it above my cardstock so I get a light little splatters here and there. You'll notice that I tap it off first over my water bowl to get off the big splatters, so I only have light ones on my paper. So it's just water I'm using here. And I'm going to quickly put on some silver glitter embossing powder from Wow. That's another great type of embossing powder. I'm going to sprinkle it on the water, and believe it or not, the water holds the embossing powder enough for you to go ahead and heat set it. The other nice thing about this is, say you get a splatter somewhere you don't want it, or you have too many splatters or too big of a splatter, you can use a dry brush to wipe away any embossing powder on it. So you can kind of control where your splatters end up. So next, you want to go ahead and heat set it before that water dries. It takes a little bit longer to heat set because you're not only heating up the embossing powder, but you're also drying that water. And believe it or not, it will hold that embossing powder. So now I have these glitter silver speckles in my background that adds a little bit of interest. So I was using a paper there to kind of protect my embellishments. I didn't want to reheat those. And check it out. You can use water to do a splattered background of heat embossing. It's a fun trick. Okay, so now to finish this card off, I wanted a sentiment, but stamping just didn't seem right, so I decided to create another dimensional die cut. This time I cut the word wonderful from a Concord and 9th die set, and I'm layering 3 on top of each other once again. And then I'm going to put a couple layers of black embossing powder on this. So it won't look like metal, but it'll have that nice raised, smooth dimensional feel to it. By the way, this set of dies from Concord and 9th have the words lovely, incredible, and I think wonderful. Yes, and I think that's a great set for lots of different occasions. So after I've layered all my die cuts on top of each other, I press Versamark ink on the top, and I'm putting some Ranger black embossing powder on it. Now, black embossing powder scares the daylights out of me because it gets everywhere. I rarely will heat emboss a sentiment with black powder. Later in this video, I'll tell you what I do instead. But I do like black embossing powder for adding some layers onto die cuts like this. So I'm going to go ahead and put 3 layers of black embossing powder on top of my 3 layers of Wonderful Word die cuts. Now you'll notice that sometimes I work on a cutting board there. The reason I do that is that's very heat resistant and cut resistant, so I can do projects like this on it and not worry about warping anything around me or making a mess. I find that that board is a very handy tool. Even with things like watercolor, where you want things to stay nice and flat, you can tape it to that. Okay, so now back to the card. I put drops of my strong adhesive on the back of this die cut. I'm going to lay it right over my other embellishments, and then I'm going to put a heavy block on it so that it presses down, and I'm going to give that some time to dry. And believe it or not, those few dots of that strong adhesive will hold it in place. To finish off the card, I trimmed a little bit off the sides of the craft piece and put it onto a white note card. I also wanted to show you how I decorated the envelope to match. Concord and 9th has this thanks stamp set that coordinates nicely with those leaves dies. So I am going ahead and stamping the matching leaves on the envelope. I'm using some soft brown Hero Arts ink on a Gina K craft envelope. I love these envelopes. After I have stamped that, I heat set it so that ink would dry quickly. I use my anti-static powder tool, and now I'm stamping the second layer with Versamark, and I'm going to add gold embossing powder. I really think it's fun to add heat embossed details to your envelope because it really makes your envelope nice and snazzy, and in this case, it'll make it match our card perfectly. So on this example, I took my basic metallic embossing powders and used it to create a really neat accent, something completely different. But keep in mind you can do this with any embossing powders that you may have. On this example, I broke out one of my old standby embossing powders I used to use all the time, and I thought I'd show an example with that. So here I have 3 stacked leaves die cuts. This is from the same die set from Concord and Ninth that I showed you before. And remember, there are 3 die cuts glued on top of each other. So I pressed Versamark ink on the top of it, and I'm dipping it into Ranger Verdigris embossing powder. This is the most beautiful embossing powder. It's got this like tealish mint color with some gold in it, and it just gives the most beautiful results, especially on a solid image, but it looks great for this technique also. So I've put Versamark ink on the top of each of these stacked die cuts, and I'm dipping each into the powder. Now I'm going to heat them all up at once and then repeat the process. With this embossing powder, the granules are a little bit bigger, so it's really important to put a couple layers at least of embossing powder on top. I ended up doing 3. The neat thing about this embossing powder is as you heat it, the gold powder kind of rises to the top, so you get this really beautiful finish of this kind of teal color with gold in it. It's absolutely gorgeous. I can't recommend this powder enough. There are a lot of different embossing powders out there. They would all work great for this technique. So I encourage you to try whatever you have, or maybe get a few bottles of your favorite colors, or if you like glitter powders or whatever. Embossing powders are very inexpensive and last a long time. And this Verdigris embossing powder is just beautiful. Now I did stack a lovely die cut, so I have 3 stacked on top of each other. I pressed Versamark ink on it, and then I put gold over that. So I have a gold lovely embellishment to put on top of the Verdigris leaves that I created. I glued that all onto white cardstock, and then I put it onto a gold note card that I created, which is some gold cardstock from My Favorite Things. Okay, so now I wanted to show you how you could use this technique even if you only have clear embossing powder. That's what I did on the die cuts that you see here. I created some stacked die cuts from some white cardstock using the 3rd leaf die from that Concord and Ninth leaf die set. So hard to say. And I'm actually going to cut these leaves so they're hearts. So I'm going to use them as hearts instead. I wanted some color to them, so I am just using some Copic markers to scribble color onto this. And I scribble it on the front and the back so that the sides kind of pick up some of that color. You could ink these up however you want. You could use distress ink with ink blending tools. You could use whatever markers you want. Color these any way you want. So I'm going to cut this little stem off of my leaf so that it looks like a heart instead, just another way to use these dies creatively. And I'm going to add color to each of these. I'm going to kind of do a rainbow of Copic markers. Now I need to add my sentiment next to my card, and I wanted a black heat embossed sentiment. However, I don't like using black embossing powders for sentiments because the powder gets everywhere. Instead, I stamp my greeting with black VersaFine ink. It's a great fine pigment ink. And then I quickly add clear embossing powder and heat set that. It gives you the look of a black embossed image without the mess of a black embossing powder. Okay, so now that I have that background ready, it's time to make my colored embellishments have a little bit of dimension. So after I've colored them, I'm going to press my Versamark ink on the top of each of them and then dip them into clear embossing powder. I'll heat set that and repeat the process. I only did it 2 times, but you could make more layers of the clear powder if you want. All we're doing is giving it a nice shiny dimensional finish, so these look like little embellishments instead of stacked die cuts. This takes a little bit of time, but it really is worth the effort. Here you can see, when I hold it up close, you can see that nice smooth raised finish on each of the die cuts. So again, I'm going to use dots of Ranger Multi-Medium to glue these into place, and I can be sure they won't come off. I also trimmed my white cardstock to be a little bit more narrow, and I've adhered it to a black note card. And by the way, remember to put something heavy on top of the die cuts as they dry so they are sure to stick nicely onto the cardstock background. I again flicked water onto the background, and I'm going to go ahead and apply silver embossing powder onto any specks of water that I want to be heat embossed. Don't take too long for this, because if the water specks start to dry, then it won't hold the embossing powder to do the technique. After heat setting that, I have those little metallic embossed spots on the background, just something a little bit interesting to add to the card. Now before we go, I wanted to show you how I decorated the envelope to match this one. I used the Concord and Ninth script stamp set. It comes in lowercase and capitals. I'm just using the lowercase here. I've always wanted to have fancy writing, and I just don't. So this stamp set allows me to get the look of it simply by stamping the letters next to each other. It really is easy to stamp, and the results are beautiful. Okay, so that wraps up the video. I hope that this encourages you to break out your embossing powders and use them in a completely different way to create your own embellishments. As always, I link to multiple sources for all of these products in my YouTube description below. You can go over to my blog also for much more information and photos of these cards, along with a fun blog hop and giveaway. Now in the middle are 3 other videos that might be of interest. The first one shows a technique for embossing powder. The second shows another way to layer your embossing powders for stamped images. And the third shows how I store my powders. Thanks for watching. I hope you hit the subscribe button and that I'll see you again soon. Have a great day.